So if you look here on the screen, you'll see an image of a typical digital SLR camera. Now this is a Canon EOS Rebel T6i, but all of them are basically the same. There's a number of components here I want to point out. First of all, you see on the front, I'm using my mouse as a pointer so you can kind of see that moving around. This is the lens. And if you look on the front, it says 18 to 55 millimeter. That's the how wide the lens is versus telephoto. So it's like a zoom lens. The higher the number, the closer the image is in. The lower the number, the more wide the view frame is. The 18 to 55 kit lens, it's referred to as the lens that comes with the camera, more than adequate for the majority of the usage of a photo booth. So generally speaking, you want to use that zoom lens, and it's a ring right along here. If you look here where my mouse pointer is, there's a little ring right there, and that ring is what zooms that lens in and out. And so you would look through the viewfinder or the live view window on the back of the camera or in the software and turn that lens to get tighter on your subject or wider if your space may vary when you're set up. So that's what you can use there. Then if you look right here on the side of the lens, there are two switches in this particular case. Some lenses only have a single switch, but most all cameras have a autofocus. This one right there is the autofocus, and it'll just simply say A or M. It may say AF or M, but that's autofocus versus manual focus on the lens. This switch down here is a stabilizer in this particular lens. Not all lenses have that, but this one does. And since you're having it stationary and mounted in a photo booth, you can just usually set that to off. Now then, on the top of the camera, in this case right up here, is the mode dial. Now it also has an M for manual, but this is manual exposure. So you have exposure and you have autofocus. So manual exposure and manual focus. And those are the two major things that you'll be using to adjust this. And today we're going to focus primarily on the manual exposure within the camera. Now I'd like to first of all qualify all of this for all those professional photographers out there that may see this, and for people who are experienced with using your software and your camera. If you ask 10 photographers how best to light and expose a particular scene, you're going to get at least a dozen answers, and every one of them will probably work. So your mileage may vary. You may have other ways that you prefer to do things. This video is primarily focused for those that are new or just don't understand how cameras work because they're used to the iPhone generation where you just point it and push a button. Digital cameras require a little bit more knowledge to get the best results, but they're not complicated or difficult. So let's move on just to this next slide. Here we go. This is the top view. So you can look down on the top of the camera, and right here you'll see this is the mode dial. The primary two modes that you'll want to focus on are M, right there for manual exposure. That means you're going to adjust everything yourself. Manual exposure means you adjust it yourself. Where P for program means the camera would adjust things. There are times and circumstances when P may be beneficial, but we're going to focus primarily on M today. I wouldn't use any of the other modes. Some of the specialty modes on some cameras, such as sports and so on, turn off the live view. So if you have a situation where for some reason your live view is just not working, or it says live view not supported, even though it worked fine last week, it could be that you've got the camera switched over to the wrong mode. Most of the time when we see that sort of thing, somebody will say, oh yeah, I used it last week to take pictures at my daughter's birthday party or something, and they forget to change it back. So just set it on M. That's the primary thing that we're looking at. On this particular camera right here is the on-off switch. There's also a video mode. Darkroom switches on and off the video as needed, so you want to go ahead and just put it on. If you put it on video only, then Darkroom can't take still photos with it. So anytime you do that, you just want to have it set to on. On the top of the camera, you'll also see the hot shoe. This is where you would connect an adapter to plug in your external flash. If for some reason your flash is not working, it could just be that the connection is not making good contact. If you look here, these little silver spots are contacts that the camera uses to connect with the flash, and if it's not slid on there good or something, then it may not be making good contact. So you want to make sure those are making good contact. All right, let's move on to my next slide here. This is a cutaway illustration of the inside of what a digital SLR looks like. This is sort of like looking at the side of the camera, and you'll see out here in front we've got the lens right here. The red lines here indicate the image that's coming in, and then up here you have the viewfinder that you look in with your eye. This blue rectangle right here represents the sensor that's picking up the image. This little white line right here represents the shutter that opens and closes to expose the sensor to the light. And then we have this little blue angled thing right here, and this is the mirror that reflects the image up into the top part of the camera so you can see it with your eye. It's a mechanical system with a mirror, etc. Now, the way a lot of people ask questions about why do I hear a click and then it takes the picture and things like that. There's a lot of things moving when this is all taking place. So this is the way it looks when you look through it with your eye, all right, through the viewfinder. So here's how it looks when you are in live view mode. If you'll notice, the mirror swings up here out of the way, the shutter opens, and then the light can hit the sensor directly. And that's how the sensor picks up and displays the image on the screen in live view mode, so you can see that on the screen. So what happens when you take a photo? A lot of things happen, and that's why there's sometimes a delay before the picture taken, and it's just the nature of the beast when it comes to a digital SLR. So what happens is, first of all, you're looking through the live view in this particular mode, and then as soon as you get ready to take the picture, it switches back to this mode, and then back to this mode. So it goes out of live view to regular shooting mode. Then the mirror has to swing up and the shutter has to open again to expose the image. Then it all repeats again. So what happens is we tell the camera to take a photo. It swings the mirror down, closes the shutter out of live view mode. Then it swings the mirror back up, opens the lens, opens the shutter for the specified amount of time to expose the shutter or expose the sensor to the shutter, to the light, and then repeats. So there's a lot of movement going on, and that's just the nature of the basically the old school digital SLR or SLR version that's added to with the live view version. Now, mirrorless cameras, they bring in a whole other thing because they don't have that mirror and they don't have that that system that's flopping up and down. So mirrorless cameras are beginning to come out more and more that work with software. The Canon M50 is a prime example. So I'm talking about specifically about digital SLRs today. So once all this takes place, then the live view goes back to normal and you can see it back on your computer ago. So that's why you hear all those noises going on. There's a lot of movement going on with the mirror going up, shutter closing, reopening, etc. Okay. Now, another thing that you want to keep in mind when it comes to using autofocus, if you have a specified place that people are going to be standing, what I prefer to do is put a piece of tape on the ground or a line or a mat with feet on it or something so people are standing in the same spot every time, and then you can set the camera to manual focus, and that makes it a little quicker reacting. It doesn't have to take that time to focus. But here's some things to think about. If you look through the viewfinder of your digital SLR with your eye, then on the viewfinder there, you'll see a series of little red squares usually. These are the autofocus points. Older cameras like the Canon XS and some of those older ones only had a single autofocus point right in the center. But as cameras have evolved and gotten better and improved, they've added more and more autofocus points. So the typical camera like the T6i usually has, I think, 19 focus points inside, and so the camera can analyze and look at the scene, pick out the autofocus point that it wants to use or that it feels like is the best one that it can lock on, and then it focuses and takes the picture. So if you look at this particular slide right here, you see these focus points. So here's a couple of problems that can run into. You can override and select a single autofocus point. and that can be a problem. So for instance, let's say that you chose this center autofocus point, maybe by accident. Hit the little button on the back of the screen. It's usually a little dial on the back of the camera. And you selected this white. Well, this white doesn't have much contrast to see to focus. Same thing over here. If you selected this one over here that I'm pointing to, it's under his arm, then it wouldn't have enough contrast because it's just looking at a solid color to be able to focus. So what I would do is make sure if you look through the viewfinder, touch it, make sure that all the little autofocus points are lighting up, and then the camera can choose which one works the best. If it can't focus on this one, then it will pick one over here or something, and that way it can focus on stuff. If you select a single autofocus point, the default with most cameras is all of them, but it is relatively easy to accidentally bump that over. So sometimes when we see people that say, help, it's not autofocusing, that's why. It's set accidentally to a single autofocus point, and that autofocus point is on the background or some other low contrast area where it just simply can't focus. Generally speaking, I prefer to use manual. Some people will say autofocus works great for them, but be aware that autofocus can take slightly longer because it does have to focus. If the lighting is not very bright, the continuous lighting, so that the camera can't see very well, then it can take a few seconds, or half a second or something for it to actually achieve that focus. And if it doesn't achieve the focus, then it's going to give you an error message that says retaking. And that means we couldn't take a picture because it couldn't focus. So we're going to try again. So I prefer using manual focus just for a little bit more reliability and speed. But you can do it with autofocus as long as you provide enough light for the camera to see. And autofocus systems are getting better all the time. So that's a possibility. Now, here's a little chart that I wanted to kind of explain the differences between aperture and shutter speed. It's sometimes referred to as time value. In the software, when you're looking at it, you'll see TV, AV, etc. So, in fact, let me switch over one second here. Let me switch over to this right here, this screen. This is what looks like in the software. Now, if you're using a different camera, this is for the T6i. If you're using a different camera, yours maybe look a little bit differently because we pull all this information from the camera being used. If you look up here, first of all, item number 1 is the AE mode. It's manual. Now, this particular setting is the little dial on the top of the camera that you physically have to turn. You can't set that setting with software. We only display what it's set to. And the reason is you can't physically turn that dial with software. So you want to turn that dial. So if you have a problem with your camera exposing incorrectly or something, you might take a look in the camera tab and see if you see M or P or some other setting. In this case, we're talking about M. The next one underneath it, item 2, is AV. That's the aperture value. That's how much light is being let through the lens. The lens has a hole in it. If you look through the front of the lens, you'll see it's generally open all the time to the widest opening so that the image is bright for live view and you can see clearly. But then it closes down to the proper exposure, to a much smaller hole in some cases, to go with whatever exposure you have set. So the AV is the aperture value. The next one underneath that, item 3 in this slide, is the time value. Now with electronic flash, if you're using a studio strobe, and that's what I'm trying to focus on right now, is you'd probably want to have this at 60th or 100th of a second. Shutters on cameras have a specific limit that they can synchronize with a flash to. It varies from camera to camera. Typically, anything over 200th of a second is too fast. It won't synchronize, and you'll get a shadow on your image because the shutter is literally closing before the flash is completely gone off. So I would keep it at around 100th of a second. If you get that shutter speed too low, then you start picking up motion and ambient light, and that can degrade your image. So if you're using an external flash, I would use that at 100th of a second. Then underneath that, you'll see ISO. Now that stands for International Standards Organization. That's just a little bit of trivia that you probably really don't care anything about. But that dates back to film, in the days when film had sensitivity ratings, so you'd know how sensitive the film was to light. So when they came out with digital cameras, they compared kind of a comparable system so that it's all sort of calibrated the same way. The lower the number, in this case 100, the lower the number, the less sensitive the sensor is to light. So if you have a lot of light, for instance, an electronic flash can provide lots of light, then you may want to use a lower number. If you have a lower light, like a continuous ring light or something like that, you may need to use a higher number. Generally speaking, image quality degrades the higher the ISO setting. However, let me qualify that. Modern cameras like this T6i and others similar to it, the quality at higher ISOs has gotten to be so good that you really wouldn't notice or see any visual difference, especially on a 2x6 or a 4x6. You'd have to probably make a 11x14 or 16x20 and carefully compare the two before you'd see much difference. The difference usually shows up in what looks like grain or speckles or something. It's very, very, very minute. Honestly, anything less than 1200 or 1600, you're not going to see any difference at all, if at all. But with an electronic flash, because they are so bright, 100 to 200 is probably the best setting. So that's item 4, that's ISO. Another thing that affects photography part of it is if you look further down to item 5, you'll see the white balance setting. All light sources, regardless of what they are, all light sources have a unique color of light. Now our brain, our eyes, interprets all of those things to be relatively white. If you really compare the light sources, then they all are a different color. For example, sunlight is more white-blue, bright sunlight. Electronic flash is the closest to actual sunlight. So that's the closest and the most natural color spectrum to sunlight. Then you've got LEDs, which are also pretty close to the same thing as daylight. Under that would be tungsten bulbs. Tungsten bulbs are those bulbs that you screw in like at home, the big Edison bulbs, and they get hot. Those are tungsten bulbs. Tungsten bulbs are much more yellow-red. They look more like candlelight, so they're very yellow-red. And then fluorescent lights are kind of in between there, and they have a more greenish appearance. So all of these things have different colors. If you were to set your white balance to, let's say, daylight, like this example is set, and then you took a picture with flash, you took a picture with tungsten light, you took a picture with fluorescent light, you'd see that greenish hue for fluorescent and that yellow-red for the tungsten bulbs. So they all have their own colors of light. So you want to match your white balance. In many cases, you can use auto and do a pretty good job. That's where the camera analyzes the scene and sets it for you based on every photo. But sometimes, depending on the circumstances, auto can yield very inconsistent results, especially with green screen, because it's affected by what the people are wearing. If someone's wearing a white shirt versus a black shirt, the auto white balance can interpret that a little differently. So in most cases, it's best to set it at what you want. Now, some cameras, not all cameras, but some cameras, you can set the white balance for the actual photo differently than the live view. And that's listed in the camera settings. You'll see live view auto white balance or live view white balance. And so sometimes you may have to set that to auto depending on if your camera accepts, because you want the live view to look right, you want the photo to look right, and so on. So white balance is what affects the color of your photo. If it's looking of the wrong color, you can adjust the white balance. Okay, let's move on to our next slide and see what our next thing is. I want to go back to this one. This is the one I had up a few minutes ago. If you notice, across here I've got the aperture values 1.4, f2, 2.8, and so on down. And you can see the hole gets smaller as you go down. Then if you look at the resulting example photo, there's a thing called depth of field. That's how much of the scene is in focus. So a large number, for instance right here, 1.4, you'll see that the subject is in focus critically right where it's focused, but the distance objects are out of focus. But as the number gets bigger and bigger and the hole gets smaller and smaller, you'll see that more and more things become in focus. So that's why sometimes I've seen people on Facebook say, help, the live view looks out of focus, but the pictures are fine. Well, that's because the live view is wide open, where the pictures are taken stop down. So when it stops down, then more things are in focus. So that's called depth of field. So anyway, that's called depth of field. Now underneath this row here, you'll see the shutter speeds. If you look here, you'll see in this illustration, and this is a little exaggerated, but as the shutter speed gets slower and slower, you have more and more motion blur. So if something is moving, if people are jumping around or whatever, and you're using a slow shutter speed, then you've got motion blur that brings into that. Typically with an electronic flash, you'll have a sharp image where the flash went off, but motion blur around that. So you'll see a sharp with a motion blur image on top of that. Typically you want to keep your shutter speed at around 60th to 100th of a second. Also remembering that if you go beyond what the camera flash sync speed is, and most of the time it's around a 200th of a second, it can vary with cameras, then you've got the shadow that you can get because the shutter's closing before the electronic flash completes. Now if you look at this last row, you'll see all of the ISO markings. Here you've got 50, 100, 200, etc. And the illustration shows the image degrading and getting more and more grainy. This is really somewhat exaggerated, probably on a 2x6 especially, or on a 4x6 print. From 100 to 1600, you're probably not going to see a difference. I wouldn't be afraid of, with modern cameras like the T6i, of using 1600 or even 3200 in a lot of cases if you're using continuous light. If you're using an electronic flash like Studio Strobe, then you probably wouldn't need to use more than 100 or 200 because those are very, very bright and don't need that much. Okay, so I'm going to switch over here now and show you a little practical information. So practical information. This is the back of an Alien B flash. This is a common flash. Your mileage may vary if you're using a different brand, but they all have similar controls. You've got the on-off switch right here. And then on this particular one, it's got this modeling lamp tracking. So you would want, with a photo booth, you'd probably want to have it set to on. Okay? Tracking means it gets dimmer as you turn down the power setting. So if you had the power down at half power for the flash up here, see right here at half power, then the tracking, if that was turned on, then your modeling light would be down half. So you don't want that. Recycle also means that when the flash goes off, the modeling light dims for a second and comes back up to let you know that the flash is ready and recycled and ready to go. In this particular case, you probably want to leave it on full all the time, so I would use the on setting right here, on setting. Slave, that's another thing that may cause you fits at an event if there's a photographer or other people taking flash pictures, because what this slave does is it looks for another flash going off, and if that flash goes off, it sets this one off at the same time. Well, that's great if you're using multiple flashes and you need them all to go off at the same time, but if you're just using a single flash and someone else's flash is setting your flash off, especially just before it's about to go off for you to take a picture, then the flash went off for their picture and not for yours, and so then your photo is going to be black. So I would turn that off. Some flash units have an on-off switch for the slave. Others, you could just get a piece of black electrical tape or something and put over that if they don't have a on-off switch. Okay, over here on the right hand side, you got a test button. Now some people will tell me, oh, my flash is not going off when it takes the picture, but when I press the test button it works just fine. Okay, that just means your flash works. That does not mean that the camera is triggering the flash. So it could be a problem with your cable connected to the flash, to the camera. So you want to check that, not just push the test button here. The best way to test that is unplug the camera from the computer, the USB cable, and press the shutter release on the camera so the camera takes a picture and see if the flash goes off then. So that's the best way to test that. So I'm going to switch back just for a second to this. So let's assume for a minute that you're using a digital SLR and you're using a similar electronic flash unit like an Alien B. So here is practical numbers. People always say, what settings should I use? So what I would do is I would first of all start with setting your camera to manual. That's the dial on the top of the camera. I would set it, the aperture value. The aperture value can be set here in the software. I would set it to 8, and I would set it to 100 of a second, and then 100 ISO. Those are good starting numbers, okay? So good starting numbers. So set it manual, aperture at 8, time value at 100th of a second, and then ISO at 100. Then I would go to my flash unit, and in this case, we're using an Alien B, and I would set it about halfway, okay? Halfway. Take a picture. If that picture is too dark, then you turn the flash power up, slide it to the right. If the picture is too bright, then slide this down to the left to turn the flash power down, keeping all your camera settings the same. And so that way you can vary it up and down. Now, let's say, for instance, you because of the circumstances, it could be that the subject is too far away or whatever, but let's just say that even with the flash all the way up, it's still too dark at f8. All right, so let's go back to this, and what I would do in that case is I would go up on the ISO. Now the magic of all of these numbers is if you double it, it gets twice as bright. Okay, so if you go from 100 to 200, that's twice as bright. If you go from 100 to 400, that's 4 times as bright. So you can just increment this up to whatever you need to change it to, 200 or 400 or whatever, to make it brighter. But those starting at that point, if you start at M and f8 or aperture 8, time value 100th of a second and ISO 100, and then on your flash unit start in the middle right here, and then you've got room to go up or down either way to make it brighter or darker. So when you get to your event, let's say that the settings you used last time, the pictures are darker. Why is that? Well, there's a lot of things that go into it. First of all, you may be slightly different on your subject to camera distance. Let's say that last time you were 6 feet from the subject, this time you're 8 feet from the subject. Well, that's a little bit further, so the light diminishes as it travels that extra couple of feet, so the images might be a little bit darker. Let's say your background is different. You're using a different background or something. Or maybe the ceiling is dark instead of white. Or the ceiling is 20 feet in this building and it was 10 feet in the last one. All of those things can have an effect. So there is no one setting that is perfect and will always work in every circumstance. That's why they have all these adjustments. So you can make those kinds of adjustments. So knowing how to adjust that and being able to go up or down with your exposure is a good thing to be able to do. Now, once you make those adjustments and you get that setting like you want, if you go back right here in the software, you'll see Save Settings. So this is based on the camera connected. So in other words, if you plug in a T6i this time and you save settings, but then next time you plug in a Nikon 5300, then it's going to look for settings for a Nikon 5300 and not the T6i. So it's based on the camera itself. If you click on Load Settings, then it'll pull up a menu of all the save settings that you have, and you can choose one. If you click the Auto Restore button and this is on the right hand side of the camera tab, all this I'm talking about. If you click the auto restore button, then every time you plug in that specific camera, it'll restore the last settings used. So that's something you can do to keep up with all those settings and reuse the same ones every time. Okay, let me switch over here to another screen. One thing that I wanted to point out, this is in the Live View tab. So there is only one thing in the software that can affect whether or not your flash is fired, and that is if there is a pause or not. This primarily affects Canon cameras. A lot of people say Nikons don't need it. That's not true. You can't take a photo with a camera in live view just because of the design of digital SLRs. That mirror has to swing up out of the way that I was showing you earlier. Canons let you override that and turn it off and not pause the live view, where Nikons they don't let you override that. So no matter what you set this pause live view to on a Nikon, it's going to put in enough pause to still trigger the flash, where Canons let you override that. So if you're using a Canon camera generally, or if for whatever reason your flash is not firing at all, then you want to set this pause live view to capture photo to at least 1 second. And that way you'll have the live view firing out of the way so that this flash can actually go off. Another thing that can affect, another thing I wanted to say about that is if it's intermittent, so if it's never flashing, then it could be that you need to set that pause. If it's set to pause and it's still never flashing, then that's most likely a camera connection thing. The cable from your camera to your flash is not screwed on good or something. If it's flashing intermittently, sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. That could be that you've got the time between photos too short and the flash is not recycling quick enough. So if it flashes on the first one but not the second one, you may need a little more time in between photos. That's typically more common with battery powered flash units. It could also be that you just don't have a good connection and something shakes, something moves, vibrates, whatever, and it causes it to lose connection and it doesn't trigger the next time. So you want to make sure that cable connection is good. Again, you can unplug the USB, trigger it from the camera to see if that's working from the camera. But the only thing in software that controls flash firing is this pause right here. Another thing is if your live view is dark, so you've got it all set up, everything's working, it's taking the pictures look good, but the live view itself is dark. This external flash compensation, this is something that only applies to Canon cameras. Again, Nikon cameras don't need that because they have an override on that does it for itself. But Canon cameras require this external flash compensation, and it just shows up when the camera's connected and you just check that box. That's in the Live View tab. Okay, now then, let's see, what else? I wanted to talk a little bit about placement. We talked about exposure, we talked about white balance. Another thing on white balance, it's best to keep your light consistent, all one type of light. Because if you have mixed lighting, especially with a green screen, you've got some light that's yellow red, some light that's green, some light that's white. All these different colors of light can cause your picture to be off color in places. And so it's best to keep all consistent. So use only one kind of light. Sometimes I've heard people say, I've got plenty of light. I've got a fluorescent here, and I've got a LED there, and I've got a flash on the camera. And you've just really complicated your situation by having multiple light sources. So generally speaking, a single light source is best for a photo booth. Now, if you look at this illustration that I have right here, this is sort of an illustration. We got a background back here. We got our subject with a little bit of distance between the background. Here's our camera, and here's our flash. Now, the flash in this case is going into an umbrella. Now, the umbrella in this case is what's called a light modifier. The light coming directly out of the flash, out of this reflector right here, is very harsh. It's very directional. Its shadows are very sharp, and it's not very flattering. So most people use in some form what's called a light modifier. Now there's a lot of different light modifiers, and a lot of it honestly is more personal preference. Some people prefer a softbox. Some people prefer what's referred to as a brolly box, which is sort of a half softbox, half umbrella. All of these things can produce adequate lighting, softness, and do a great job. I personally prefer an umbrella like you see in this illustration just because they're quick to set up, they fold up easy, they're relatively inexpensive. You can have a couple of them in case they get damaged, which sometimes they do. The larger the umbrella, the softer the light. So if you have an 18-inch umbrella versus a 36-inch umbrella, you're going to get a better quality of light with a 36-inch umbrella than you would an 18-inch umbrella. The downside is it takes up more room. It's longer. It's bigger in the camera case. It's bigger, on the flash. So I've used both. In fact, I keep both of them, and if I get somewhere and I got plenty of room, and oh great, I'll use the 36. Oh, but no, this particular place is crowded and cramped. I'll use the smaller one. So it just depends on circumstances. With a photo booth, a smaller one might work better. Your mileage may vary. Again, 10 photographers, 12 different answers, etc. So anyway, the modifier softens the light, makes it coming from a much larger area. It gives you softer shadows, more flattering light. I would, if possible, I would always use a modifier of some kind. If you have a photo booth that has like a little plexiglass panel, the flash is behind and it shines through that. Basically what they've done there is they've built a softbox into the cabinet. So instead of one that's made of fabric and folds up, it's built into the cabinet. So that's technically a softbox. So that's what your light modifier is. So there's a lot of different light modifiers. But in this particular illustration, if you're further back one day or closer up another day because of the space you have to set up or something, your exposure is going to vary. So you want to be able to adjust that a little lighter, a little darker, and that's back to that little slider on the back of the flash. Okay, let's see what else. I'm going to run back through some of these settings just for a second to reiterate. First of all, if you're using an external flash, you want to go with manual. Aperture, start off at f8 or aperture at 8. And your time value at 1/100th of a second, and then your ISO at 100. And then you want to use the adjustment on your flash right here, start it at a half, and then go up or down depending on whether you need it a little lighter, a little brighter. So you can make that adjustment back and forth. Again, there is no one size fits all. There is no perfect setting that will work in every circumstance. So you might need to adjust that with every event. And the best thing to do is just take a test shot and print it out and see what it looks like. If it's too dark, lighten it up. If it's too bright, darken it down. And you can make those adjustments on the back of the flash. I believe that covers everything. Hopefully you got something from this. So this is, again, for an external flash. If you're using a constant light, now there's a lot of other variables if you're doing video, if you're doing constant light. You can't use a flash if you're doing video. You have to have constant light. If you're using a booth that has like a ring light or some other constant form of light, then you're going to use a higher ISO and possibly a more open aperture value or something like that to adjust the lighting. The best thing in most cases is always going to be to use manual exposure, because that's going to be more consistent. If you're using program auto exposure, then anytime somebody's clothing changes, it's going to vary a little bit because the camera is seeing that darker shirt or that brighter shirt and trying to adjust for it. So it's always going to be better to use manual exposure. I would strongly recommend you set up your photo booth, put it in your living room, play with it, make some adjustments, see what it looks like, at this aperture. Then try that other aperture, just different ones, different ISO settings. Find what works and what you need to change to get the results you want. So if you look at the photo and it's too dark, you know what to change. If you look at the photo and it's too light, you know what to change. And that way you're not running to Facebook at the event going, help, my pictures are too dark. You know what to do and what adjustments that need to be made. I hope you got something out of it. If you have any other questions, give us a call. Thank you very much and have a great day.